"Take Buzzard Hill," Rufus said, tossing the old shed key across the pine table. "It isn't worth putting a plow into." The words sounded almost casual, but Seth Calderon understood exactly what his brother was doing. It was spring of 1887, and after their father Jonah Calderon's death, the three brothers had gathered to divide the family property. Rufus, the eldest, claimed the rich western bottomland, where deep black soil and a dependable spring promised easy harvests. Orson took the southern fields and the irrigation ditches. Seth, the youngest, received the land nobody wanted, a steep, rocky hill covered with basalt, broken sandstone, dry sagebrush, and hard earth. "You're still young," Rufus told him without meeting his eyes. "You can always hire yourself out." Seth quietly asked whether the hill carried any rights to the family well. Rufus answered coldly, "No. The well is on my land." Seth's wife Eleanor stood near the window, holding the agreement so tightly her fingers trembled. Seth did not argue. He signed the paper, then reached for their father's worn pencil. While his brothers admired their rich fields on the map, Seth marked a faint line crossing Buzzard Hill. He remembered that line. Years earlier, his father had shown him old stones hidden beneath the brush and told him that water once traveled across that slope before the lower ditch was built. In the weathered cabin waiting on the hill, Seth discovered an old stone hammer, hemp rope, measuring stakes, and a battered notebook. Only one sentence remained. Water once crossed here before the lower ditch was cut. The next morning, Seth climbed the hill with Tucker, their shaggy cattle dog. He drove a pry bar beneath a huge basalt rock and levered it from the ground. Beneath it was something nobody expected: dark, cool soil holding moisture. Seth pressed his palm against it and felt hope where his brothers had seen nothing. He began measuring the slope with an A-frame level, marking contour lines with wooden stakes. Rufus eventually came to watch. "When are you planting?" he asked. Seth answered, "When the ground can keep what I put in it." Instead of plowing, Seth began building a dry stone terrace. He placed large stones at the foundation, locked smaller rocks between them, and leaned the wall gently into the hillside. Eleanor carried water while Seth worked from dawn until evening. The trading post soon gave him a mocking name, Calderon's Stairway to Nowhere. Seth ignored every laugh. Then a light rain came. Water rushed down the hill but slowed behind his first wall. Fine soil settled instead of washing away. Seth thought his experiment had worked until the next morning, when 12 feet of the wall bulged outward. One mistake could destroy everything. Seth took the wall apart stone by stone. He rebuilt the foundation wider, staggered the joints, and added larger through stones. His hands bled, his old wrist injury returned, and money for tools disappeared. But Seth understood something his brothers did not. A mountain did not become valuable because someone declared it so. It became valuable when someone learned how to listen to it. The first real test came when Seth tried hauling larger stones uphill with Mororo, his bay mare. One afternoon, a loaded sled slipped backward on loose rock. Seth cut the rope just before the sled smashed part of his new terrace. Mororo fell hard but survived with only bruises. Rufus watched from below and shouted that the hill would kill his horse before it ever fed his family. Seth said nothing. He checked every leg and hoof of the mare before touching a single broken stone. From that day forward, he abandoned the straight climb and carved a zigzag trail across the slope so Mororo would never have to fight the entire grade at once. Slowly, the terraces climbed higher. Seth mixed willow branches, old sagebrush, manure, and fine soil behind the stone walls, creating planting pockets deep enough for roots to survive. Eleanor recorded every seed and every handful of grain in her notebook because their money was running out. They planted flint corn, beans, squash, and native grass. A retired surveyor named Edwin Harrow eventually visited Buzzard Hill expecting to prove Seth foolish. Instead, he measured the terraces and discovered the first wall was slightly off contour. That small mistake was forcing water toward one end. Seth did not defend himself. He asked how to correct it. Edwin showed him where wider spillways were needed, and Seth immediately rebuilt the weak sections. By late summer, the difference became impossible to ignore. Seth's crops were smaller than the valley crops, but his soil remained dark and damp. Rufus's field, meanwhile, was beginning to crack. Then came the drought of 1888. The spring feeding Rufus's land weakened, then stopped. Orson's irrigation ditch became a line of mud. The valley grass turned gray, and the corn curled beneath the relentless sun. Seth did not pretend his hill was flourishing. His plants were short, and some had failed completely. But the terraces were holding moisture. Stone mulch shaded the soil. The spillways carried excess water away when brief showers arrived. Beans remained green beneath the walls. Squash leaves spread across protected pockets, and the deepest soil stayed cool even after weeks without rain. Eleanor tested the earth every few days and recorded the results. One afternoon, Martha Bell, a widow who farmed another rocky slope, climbed Buzzard Hill carrying an empty basket. She expected to see a miracle crop. Instead, Seth showed her something more important: dark soil protected behind a terrace. Crops can fail, he told her, but the soil should not have to. Martha understood. Down in the valley, Rufus watched his cattle grow thin. Orson abandoned part of his fields. Amos Dreenan began selling livestock because there was no grass left. Buzzard Hill was still far from rich, but it was alive. Rufus finally climbed the terraces himself and saw something that wounded his pride more than any insult could have. Seth's land was surviving the disaster that was destroying the fields Rufus had once called superior. He noticed bundles of grass beneath the shed and asked Seth how much feed remained. Seth knew exactly just enough for his own animals through winter. Rufus asked to buy half. Seth initially refused, remembering the stolen water rights and the unfair division. But Eleanor reminded him that their father had never wanted his children to watch hungry animals suffer. They agreed to sell 8 bundles and a wagon of dried stalks. Rufus drove away silently. Seth watched the struggling calves behind the wagon and realized the hill had taught him another lesson. Survival meant more than keeping what belonged to you. By the end of summer, everyone in the valley knew the truth about Buzzard Hill. It had never been worthless. It had simply been misunderstood. Seth harvested fewer crops than his brothers had planted, but he harvested something they no longer possessed enough food to survive. He gathered flint corn, beans, squash, and cured grass while the valley below stood nearly empty. Rufus's once famous bottomland had become hard and cracked. Orson's irrigation channels carried almost nothing. The drought had taken the fields because their owners had trusted the land to keep giving without changing the way they farmed it. Seth had done the opposite. He had slowed water, protected soil, used stone for shade, planted carefully, and accepted that a hillside had its own rules. Then, just as people began believing the drought would never end, the sky changed. Dark clouds gathered over Cinderback Ridge. Seth recognized the danger immediately. The ground was dry, the slopes were exposed, and a heavy storm could turn the entire valley into a river. He and Eleanor checked every spillway before sunset. Rain arrived that night with frightening force. Water poured down the mountainside. Across the valley, fields that had been plowed smooth offered nothing to slow the runoff. Mud surged through Rufus's bottomland. Orson's irrigation ditch broke in 3 places. Fence posts disappeared beneath rushing water. But on Buzzard Hill, Seth's terraces caught the first wave. Water spread across the contour walls instead of racing straight downhill. Brush trapped sediment. Stone spillways carried excess flow safely toward bare rock. Several sections cracked under the pressure, but the foundations held. At dawn, Seth climbed the hill expecting destruction. Instead, he found fresh dark silt resting behind the terraces. The crops were battered, but the soil remained. Down below, Rufus stood beside his ruined field in silence. For the first time, he looked toward the hill not with pity, but with respect. Months later, the valley began rebuilding. Martha Bell copied Seth's terrace design on her own rocky slope. Farmers started asking Edwin Harrow to teach them proper contour measurements. Rufus repaired his fields differently than before. He built smaller terraces, protected the soil, and eventually restored the water system he had once refused to share. One evening, Rufus climbed Buzzard Hill carrying their father's old map. He stopped beside Seth and held it out. "You saw something we didn't," he admitted. Seth looked at the faint line he had circled years earlier. "Father saw it first," he said. "I only remembered." Rufus lowered his head. "I thought I gave you the worst land." Seth looked across the terraces, where green plants were growing between ancient stones. "You gave me land nobody understood." Eleanor stepped onto the porch with Tucker beside her. Mare grazed near the shed, healthy and calm. The hill that had once been mocked as useless had become the safest ground in the valley. And Seth never forgot the lesson his father had unknowingly left behind. Sometimes the land everyone rejects is hiding the greatest gift. Not because it is easy, but because it forces you to learn how to make it live. Wild West Taley's stories would remember that hill for generations. Not as Buzzard Hill, but as the place where one man proved that patience, knowledge, and courage could turn the land nobody wanted into the land everyone wished they had.